Cut that out.
What is this top of the morning stuff? You know, Dawn O'Neill, I mean, I think she's on the West Coast where it has to be like 5 o'clock in the morning. She's probably up drinking a cup of coffee, stretching, and doing her pickleball preparations for the morning because she's
hello, old boy. Top of the morning.
And what's this? I see Maury here. I get a disturbing note from Maury last night that Maury was banished apparently from the comments section by the gods of YouTube because of bullying. And yet here's Maury straight away. I can post here, it seems, but not on an already published video. I don't know. But here's the deal. YouTube, leave us alone. Please, YouTube editors. I want to be polite because I don't want to be banished for violating the community standards. But, you know, we can handle our own criticism. We can handle a little bit of fractious communication. We can handle whatever happens here. We just don't need you to step on our comment section and say, oh, folks, you're violating the Grey Poupon rules. You're being insufficiently sensitive to the DEI imperative that we recognize every life form of equal value. That includes the bathroom fungus, which you must not attack, and it includes, you know, any funkiness in the air. Maury, welcome back. Stay back. Keep commenting. Don't let YouTube get you down. Go to X. Go to Rumble. You know, keep talking and keep squawking, and we'll keep walking. What up?
Lawyer Will is over on
U.S. Supreme Court.
On Lawyer Will's over on Rumble this morning. He says good morning, and he says great interview with Pete. Which is correct. It is a great interview. And I can say that because I contributed maybe 0.5% to the totality of that, although I was there for the whole thing. Do go and subscribe to the LAL newsletter. You don't have to be subscribed. You can go to our YouTube channel and you can find that hour and 15-minute long-form interview with Pete Atkinson with a central theme of grace. It's great. And you'll see it.
Didn't we get a pretty cool comment from Mary Hausler about that?
Yeah, we got a wonderful comment.
Can you read that? So look, Pete Atkinson. Pete Atkinson is a Catholic and intelligent and well-read, a student of the classics, and a person who has devoted his life to responding to what he takes to be his divine mission in life. And I don't mean that in some sort of nutty Catholic suicide.
No, not at all. Not at all.
No, but basically he wants to bring a message of grace, of the impossible challenge of responding in faith to the ever-present love of a God who's forever hidden, but everywhere in view and available to those with the eyes of faith. And Pete walks that walk. He's involved with the Merry Beggars, and he talks about that in the interview. I find him infinitely intriguing because he is unapologetic, intensely introspective, and well-read. And he has a faith that has sustained, a form of faith that has sustained Western civilization for several millennia and is evaporating with consequences that ripple throughout our society. And so I commend the interview to you. I didn't participate much either. I just asked a couple stupid questions and sat and listened to him. So what did Mary Hausler have to say?
Mary says, quote, "Thank you. I enjoyed this. Although I don't feel God has ever spoken to me, I do feel he walks with me. My life has had many disappointments, but I continue to look for the subtle signs and the connections that he establishes for me with others. Being tuned in and practicing a degree of acceptance makes the journey tolerable." I think that's that whole comment is indicative of the general tone and demeanor of that entire episode. I was overwhelmed. So much so that I didn't find a way to inject myself into the conversation. And I know you were having fun.
In other words, right? You regular listeners would find it hard to believe, but Mike was actually speechless.
Yep. Yeah, I was. And, before the episode started, we had talked a little bit about, the naming of children. I think, Pete's got his newest edition due in April. And the thought about what is in a name for a child was, infinitely intriguing. And we weren't even 30 seconds into the conversation. So I was already I was already on my heels for the rest of that.
Oh, let me tell you something. I've got a funny name story. I was almost named Archie, and I can't tell you how infinitely happy I am that I wasn't. My father, my father was a little rough around the edges,
I got that Archie Bunker.
No, it was worse than that. He snuck into the country in the 1930s with his father, crossing from Windsor into Detroit, and then lived at gunpoint for a number of years. Shot somebody in 1954, had to flee Detroit to get away from, as he put it, the heat. So he took off with this young woman he was dating, who became my mom, and they settled in Chicago. So, he found the straight life a little bit difficult. Split. I didn't see him for a number of years. Off we go. And damn it, I'm a senior moment. I'm forgetting why I went into that riff.
Archie.
Oh, and so he tells the story, or the story has been told to me, that at or about the time I was born, he had money on a fighter named Archie Moore. And if Archie had won that night, I would have been Archie. So whoever kicked Archie Moore's ass that night, thank you infinitely. But instead, I became the norm, as you all know now at 8 o'clock most mornings. When you need your fix on where to go in the world to understand the currents that define our lives and get some insight onto it, you come to the norm. And Mike gets us mic'd up. So, here we are. What's up with the U.S. Supreme Court? I mean, Drew Faust, former president of Harvard, and author of a book, a recent book on suffering in the Civil War. David Blight, a scholar at Yale, who, if you've not yet, if you're not aware of the Yale Open Courses series on YouTube or elsewhere, it's a real treat. You can go into courses that are videoed and placed online for free from Yale, and one of them that I find just wonderful, I'll probably listen to it again, is David Blight's class on the American Civil War. It's almost like listening to a poet describe something. He's that good. Drew Faust, Connie Lepore, we all know her from the New Yorker, and her works on recent American history. And then John Fabian Witt, who I don't know. I guess I am witless when it comes to Mr. Witt. The four of them have joined forces to write an amicus brief to the United States Supreme Court. And in that amicus brief, what they contend is that Donald Trump is almost as bad as Jefferson Davis. And they urge the court to find the means as a matter of law to disqualify him from the ballot. And in their brief, they, of course, have to waive the fact that we've won more Pulitzers, more Bancroft Awards than just about any other collection of four people you'll ever read a brief from. And we're so wonderful that you should take our insights into what the law should become and enact it into the law of the land. I guess anybody can file an amicus brief in the United States Supreme Court. And
they're just letting anybody file them these days.
Yeah, but and I can't, I mean, Drew Faust, former president of Harvard, Civil War scholar.
I think this is important strategically from a legal perspective, because I think I said to you, look, they're likening Trump to Jefferson Davis, and you would ask, well, why is that? Well, it's right there in the section title. So this is further down in the document. Section A reads, the Jefferson Davis case showed that Section 3 required no criminal conviction and was self-executing. So this is incredibly important from the interpretation of the court, because what have we talked about, Norm? We've talked about a number of things within the confines of the Section 3 14th Amendment context. But one of those is that he has not been criminally labeled or adjudicated as an insurrectionist. There have been no underlying proceedings which establish that he is an insurrectionist until this Colorado case was brought before the court in Colorado, right? So this particular section, which is alleging that the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is self-executing, would inoculate and give the court presumptively reason to do away or discard any sort of issue related to the lower court needing to go through a factual finding of him being an insurrectionist as a conclusion of law, and give the power to the court to say that he may still be kept off of the ballot because of the comparison to the Jefferson Davis post-Civil War and Reconstruction era.
I see it a little bit differently, Mike. We may come to the same place in the end. Here, so this notion of a clause of the Constitution being self-executing, what that means is that it, on its face, its meaning is so obvious that a person given the duty to enforce constitutional provisions can do so ministerially without thought. So, for example, if a person can't be president until they're the age of 35, sorry to do this to you, Mike. I know you turn 34 soon. You're going to have to wait to make for that Boyer for president run. But that's largely
for the Vivek cabinet. Don't worry.
Mike comes into the Secretary of State's office in North Carolina. I want to get my name on the presidential ballot. They ask him to fill out a form. Age, he writes 34 or 33. That person can say, "I'm sorry, sir, you're ineligible." In other words, any idiot can do that. How do you conclude that Trump was an insurrectionist in the same way? You don't. And so what happened in Colorado is the Secretary of State reached that conclusion, forcing Trump to go into court to challenge the reasoning. And then there was an evidentiary hearing.
Norm,
Um,
just a quick correction. Again, the defendant in Colorado was the Secretary of State. It was a petition brought forth by a NGO, a group,
okay.
and they had that super long, detailed, 100 and something page brief that they filed with the court, making the claim and trying to use all the justification, the evanescence of insurrection to say that the court should conclude that he was an insurrectionist for purposes of the 14th Amendment, Section 3.
But at least that was some process. It wasn't self-executing in that way. And there was the ability to have some judicial findings of fact and so forth. The notion that this clause can be, and thank you for the correction, Mike. I do stand corrected. As always, the beauty of being alive is every day you get to prove the truth that to err is human. I'm human. I'm not an AI bot. We'll talk more about augmented intelligence and the promise of Elon Musk's implants in your brain in just a few moments, I promise. But in Maine, the Secretary of State did what I proposed. She reached this conclusion and forcing Trump into court. In Colorado, it wasn't self-executing. The notion that and I think this is one of the critical issues that the United States Supreme Court is going to have to face in this case is, what is the method for determining whether a candidate for office was a quote-unquote insurrectionist? There has to be a method. The Constitution can't be self-executing in that way, because the definition of insurrection is, if not vague, not obvious. It is obvious to most of us what a date of birth means, unless you're Maury and you sprang fully formed from the head of Medusa and graced God and graced the world with your godlike presence online. Most of us had a mom and dad. Somebody did the wild thing. Mom screamed. They injected her with Pitocin to induce labor, or she just did it, or you popped out from a C-section. You took your first gulp of air and said, speaking your primal language, learning English, presumably as your second, third, or fourth language, and off you go into humanity. We know what it is to give birth, but we don't know what it is to engage in insurrection. And in these highly partisan times, where analogy is key and hysteria is the breath that we all inhale with our political papers in the morning, calling someone an insurrectionist is just too easy to do. And so there has to be standards. And when there have to be standards, this evokes due process, notice, an opportunity to be heard, fair proceedings, fair warning. And so it seems to me that at a minimum, the U.S. Supreme Court has to reach a conclusion about the methodology for determining what insurrection is. And I remind regular listeners, you've heard this before, new listeners, you may hear it for the first time. No one has ever proven in a court of law, in an adversarial proceeding, that Donald Trump was involved in inspiring January 6th.
Yes.
What
So
we've got
Lawyer Wood just made that point in the chat. So I wanted to give him his flowers. He says it's not obvious that Trump in any way caused an insurrection. And I think that's exactly why I'm focusing on this. Even acknowledging the comparison within this amicus brief to Jefferson Davis, to me, is facially absurd, right? We're talking about Jefferson Davis, who is the president of the Confederate secession, whatever we wanted to call that, right? In what way, factually, can we look and point to Trump and use that as a meaningful comparison, even if there are substantive points to be made about the process by which he would have been adjudicated, or what processes may have been pushed off the rails or misguided intentionally or otherwise? It's like we don't even have a threshold agreement on that as a useful comparison, at least on this stream in this podcast.
No, and here's the chilling thing about what I will call the scholar's brief, the Lepore, Faust, Blight, and Witt brief. They're not pretending to know how to manipulate legal standards. They're not pretending to understand constitutional process. They're making moral judgments about history, and they're trying to become our moral censors. And they're trying to say, look, We are authorities on the past, and therefore we can speak from the mountaintop, and we can inform those of you engaged in the quotidian, that is day-to-day struggle of administering justice. We can inform you about the meaning of the deeper principles that unite us. Trust us. It didn't work, Drew, when you were president of Harvard. It doesn't work, Connie, when you're penning essays for the New Yorker. David, I love your open course on the Civil War at Yale, and you speak with the resonance of a poet. Wit, if you've got any, I don't know it yet. I'll be reading up on you. I see your name in footnotes to things I've been reading lately. I confess a certain amount of ignorance. Oh, poor me. I guess that means I'm not capable of understanding these issues, because until the intelligentsia speaks, until the Ivies come forward,
until the American historians,
until the
right?
professoriate tells us what to do.
Brief of Amicus theory in American historians in support of respondents. I mean, it's like, I can't even get over that part, right? We are the American historians.
Well, maybe you and I'll write a brief, Mike, bar stools for Trump. On behalf of the aggrieved people sitting around at bar stools around the country who think the country's going to hell in a handbasket, and global elites need a swift kick in the ass, and anybody who breaks their foot should be paid reparations for the loss of their foot for doing the American service, blah, blah, blah. We want Trump. American historians in support of respondents. I'm going to read the brief with great interest, but I'm not going to read it expecting to learn anything about the law. History matters. I get that.
And I think I told you there's a footnote for any fellow North Carolinians that are watching. I'm going to scroll to this footnote on page 25 that I found interesting. Maybe it's a little further down, maybe 27 here. I'll find it.
Yeah, I know you're numerically challenged.
We don't count very well here in the South.
Hi, welcome.
Here it is. It's talking about the Southern resistance to Section 3, and North Carolina is called out by name here. That we actually, our legislature proposed an alternative amendment omitting Section 3 at the time that this came up, and the footnote actually leads to Joseph B. James' Southern reaction to the proposal of the 14th Amendment. And this was penned in 1956. So that at least gives me something, to your point, to follow up on, Norm, from a historical.
No, that's right. I mean, it's a fascinating debate, fascinating discussion. The politics of virtue are always troublesome. If you want to know what a global elite looks like when it's trying to tell you what to do, ask yourself who owns the past. These folks own it, and they're going to tell the Supreme Court how to use it, whether you like it or not. Hey, where do we go next? I guess Elon, Neuralink. Elon had a little test run yesterday, a brain chip implant in a human. What happened?
So obviously we've talked about Neuralink before, and I'll put the tweet up here first, because I think that actually.
So what we're talking about is augmented intelligence, folks. That is using an external device to harness whatever juice you bring to the intelligence game, and make it better.
Yep. So he tweets yesterday, the first Neuralink product is called telepathy. And then his follow-up tweet says, enables control of your phone or computer, and through them almost any device, just by thinking.
Oh my God. So what does that mean? I'm sitting there with my wife, and she says something that I'm afraid to comment on, and I'm thinking, fuck you. And she gets a text message that says that. This is going to create real problems. I mean, what about
well, imagine if you could just, control the use of limbs that you've lost the use of, Norm, just by thinking. That would be a more interesting conversation with your wife, perhaps.
Slapping myself in the stop it. Stop it.
So what we in the use of limbs, I think, has been what Elon Musk has really located the initial phases of this around. So I think that what we're talking about is quadriplegia, so the loss of all four limbs, and then ALS, which if anyone watching, I feel like we all have a story of ALS in our families, or extended families. So this, at least from a public health perspective, I think is bringing dignity to diseases that our medical community has yet to figure out a way to mitigate and overcome. So I do think that it's important from that perspective. Anybody who's watched the loss of a loved one, and also watched the deterioration in their motor functions, their speech, and those sorts of things, understand what an undignified way it is to succumb to those sorts of issues. So I think that from that perspective, I think that there's a huge benevolent underpinning to that. However, I did put up, is Neuralink overall a chilling promise, Norm?
No, I hear you. I mean, look, I mean, you raise a great point. I mean, I recall very well a federal judge who I admired succumbing to ALS. I had one of the last arguments in front of him before he was permanently disabled and died. And it was heartbreaking because I knew that trapped within a body that was failing to respond to what was going on in his mind was a mind that was fully alive, that was capable of grace, dignity, subtle distinctions, and took great delight in the intricacies of the law. But sitting there watching him was painful. And so, to the degree that Neuralink, this augmented technology, can help restore the connection between his mind and his body, it's a wonderful thing. But do we really think that it'll be limited to that? You know, embedded within our law is the concept of personhood and personal responsibility. And we say that individuals equipped with agency are responsible for the consequences of their actions. Once you augment that with a technological supplement, are you going to say, are you going to open it up to a person to say, well, you know, I wouldn't have thought that but for the link? Or in my playful example, you know, I mean, you know, you take a Freudian analysis of the human personality and the three centers of energy in the psyche, the id, that is that sense of desire and an ability to acquire and incorporate the world out of appetite, the superego, that sense of ethics, what is appropriate under the circumstances, what we should and shouldn't do, the ego, that realistic intermediary that makes cost benefit analyses of all the impulses we have and consistent with our plans acts in conformity therein. What's a Neuralink person going to say when it taps in to libidinal things and communicates on devices on thoughts that are latent, that is unexpressed, but now find a way to express themselves? I find the Neuralink project unavoidable, incredibly fascinating, but the law of unintended consequences is going to create enormous challenges for lawyers, for ethicists, theologians, and philosophers.
Well, and I think that more directly, I consider those who are not the targeted participants as sort of what we're talking about right now. Those who are, you know, reasonably functioning human adults in society, right? Those who have profit motives in business, Wall Street, you know, anywhere where entrepreneurship requires that competitive edge when it comes to timing or efficiency or a combination thereof. You know, but I also recognize that we are emotional beings, Norman. We've talked about this before. Junior Coltrane, that's a nod to you in the chat. I do wonder if this increased efficiency, this increased ability won't create real, I guess, carnal consequences because of the lack of downtime or the ability to patiently assess situations from an interpersonal perspective on a human to human basis, right?
Well, I
What
think,
is,
yeah.
you know what I'm saying is if we're thinking about those who will actually want to put a device in their head that will make them superhuman, right? For all intents and purposes, what is the natural, I guess, what are the natural consequences of that in a population that is overwhelmingly not in tune with that technology?
No, I hear you. I mean, you know, I posted Dawn's comment here. We don't know 1/millionth of 1% about anything, Thomas Edison once said. Absolutely. And, you know, my experience with extraordinarily intelligent people is that they're more modest than those who are less intelligent. Why? Because I think the function of intelligence is to be able to say what the limits of what you know is. What those limits are, rather, and or even the use of English grammar. You know, here's the fact: in a world that is infinitely broad in terms of space, in a world that is infinite in terms of time, any one individual's ability to perceive is going to be limited by infinity. And thus, the most brilliant among us still is just a spot on the infinite expanse of space and time and can only perceive so much. But knowing as much as they do, perhaps more than the person with less ability, they know how much they don't know. And that's the beginning of wisdom, is knowing what you know and what you don't. Neuralink is going to give some folks something. I don't know if it's a leg up, if it's more insight, but what it can't do, I don't think, is perfect human judgment, the sense of the sense of appropriateness, the sense of what is worth doing, the sense of how best to respond to the longing that defines us. Again, I'm sorry to make this into an Augustinian podcast, but that sense of longing that Augustine talks about in the Confessions, that defines and, in my view, distinguishes humankinds from computers. So, I haven't seen much written about this, Mike. I wanna know more. I
I
worry about unintended consequences.
What is the movie Limitless? Is that it? With Bradley Cooper. Have you ever seen this movie, Norm?
I don't get to see many movies.
It's worth a watch because, from a just sort of a creative and sort of imaginative perspective, you're talking about the synthesis of this one drug in a very clear pill that gives you access to 100% of your brain capacity, right? And it's highly addictive. And Bradley Cooper's challenge is that it comes into contact with this, completely turns his life around, and then realizes that, it takes away your life force when you don't have it anymore. And his challenge is to figure out how to synthesize it even further so that he can have an infinite amount of that, almost like the Holy Grail in some way, form, or fashion. But it's a huge cultural moment in America, at least in American entertainment, this idea of limitless, right? Uh,
Yeah, but you know
how
what?
do you how do you
When
become
we've
limitless, right?
There is no such thing as limitless. I mean, the genius of Catholic theology is the concept of the fall, that we live in a world that is broken, and that it is marred by original sin, and that we're cut off from our origins. And every effort to think that you've captured it all is a form of pride and conceit that obscures the fundamental truth of our radical dependency on forces unknown, unseen, and perhaps unknowable. And that at its deepest level, a life of integrity is a life of faith. And it, you know, you, and it's you, and you, here's the deal: to be human is to believe. There is a sense in which you get to choose what to believe in, and if you believe that what you see now is infinite, and it is all there is, you've made a huge mistake, and that's pride, and that's your undoing. Hey,
So last
what?
parting thought
Yeah,
here, because this is actually Dawn says this. She asks who gets to activate and deactivate the link, the government, and then Junior follows up saying the link will improve a person's base of knowledge because the link will allow them to retain massive amounts of info and recall it with light speed. I think that's sort of the issue here is that if this stuff is already in development, do we have Elon Musk to thank yet again in a la his acquisition of Twitter, now X, right? We have seen the importance of somebody who at least appears to date to be benevolent in the sense of public discourse, free speech, and communication. Do we have him to think again, sort of in this AI arms race for at least making progress in this that is removed from the government, right? So
Junior, yeah.
whether the government will seek, regulate, and use this stuff, as Dawn asks, is a separate question. I think that that's pretty obvious. However, the government will want control of the link,
Of course it will, and it'll
right?
get it.
Maybe.
Junior, here, look, the link will improve a person's base of knowledge, because it will allow them to retain massive amounts of info and recall it with light speed. Put Encyclopedia Britannica 11th edition between your ears. Supplement it with everything the World Wide Web has to offer. Know everything there is to know about the world, and it doesn't make you a person I want to sit next to on a subway,
Matrix.
because it's not necessarily going to inform your sensibilities. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power to do something. Choosing what to do isn't a function of knowledge. Choosing what to do is a function of faith and your commitments to the world. And I believe that at a fundamental level. Just like I believe that the United Nations, let me see, Relief and Works Agency is guilty of aiding and supporting a terrorist organization. Think about this for a minute. This agency apparently had at least 13 of its employees participate with Hamas in the invasion of Israel on October 7th, 2023, an invasion in which 1,200 people were killed, hundreds were kidnapped. Many of those kidnappees still have not been returned. Babies were executed, women were raped and mauled, and it was a shocking and graphic display of evil in the world in our time. And UN relief agency workers participated in it. So as a result, now the United States and 13 others are not going to fund UNRWA. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. What this is the only UN agency that is devoted to a particular region, that is to Palestine. It was created, I believe, in 1948 after the creation of the State of Israel. Some 700,000 Palestinians were displaced in that activity. And over time, it has received billions of dollars and transformed or transmitted, rather, billions of dollars to Palestine, to Gaza, rather, and to the Palestinians. But here's the funny question as a matter of American law. There is a statute in the United States that makes it unlawful to give material support to terrorists. So a certain organization was providing money to an educational foundation for Kurdistan folks, I believe, in the Middle East, and maybe in Turkey. They were accused of providing material support to terrorists, and their defense was, no, we gave this money to a group that has a terrorist wing, but we gave it to educational resources. And the court said, no, there are opportunity costs. Every dollar you gave to the educational wing freed up money for terrorism. Did the UN help broker the creation of a terrorist cell in Gaza when it gave 1.3 billion or 1.6 billion dollars to the people in Gaza, thus freeing up the opportunity to create tunnels, buy rockets, arm the 2.3 million people living on the Gaza Strip to the teeth, and inspire them with an ideology that is hostile to the state of Israel, hostile to Jews, and seeks from the river to the sea to make Palestine free, if necessary, by killing every Jew living in it? Shame on the UN. This is an absolute travesty. And I remember as a kid, in the Midwest, I'd see these billboards along the highway, U.S. out of the UN. I'm like, oh, come on, get serious. When I see UNRWA's support of Gaza, and I see the application of the material support of terrorism statute potentially used here, I see 13 of its aid workers embedded with the terrorists and participating in acts of terror. I begin to think maybe we should get out of the UN. This is absolutely crazy, Mike.
I'm looking here at the fiscal year 24 financial allocations. You'll see there toward the bottom, West Bank and Gaza under the UNRWA, food assistance, health protection, shelter, and settlements, earmarked $51 million planned for this year alone for this organization through, I think it's USAID. I just wanted to pull this up to give an idea of just how much money we're talking about is just sort of making its way from the U.S. Over into this organization. And this organization, again, I'll put this back on the screen. It pledges to be providing work to Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the Gaza Strip, West Bank, which also includes East Jerusalem. And you can click on any of these locations, and it'll bring up. They'll make sure my connection is secure. It'll bring up, and over here on the right, it gives you a ton of little factoids, right, to I guess, justify its existence and the work that it's doing, saying that there are almost 1.5 million registered refugees under this program, 286,000 students, 183 schools. But again, you and I both know these are just big categories of information without any sort of nuance or details behind them. What does it mean for there to be 286,645 students in Gaza? What does it mean for there to be almost 1.5 million registered refugees receiving this assistance? And it really gets to my
how
question.
many of them are armed? And
Well,
how many of them are, how many of them are enjoying militia training in part as a result of this financial support? And why isn't somebody in front of the International Criminal Court asking whether UNRWA has committed a war crime?
Well, and this gets to my question from yesterday as well. Back here at home, I think I was talking about the distinction between a task force and an administrative agency or a regulatory body, right? The former being organized for a specific, ascertained, and finite purpose, and the latter being apparently a self-flagellating organization that is hell-bent on creating a budget for itself ad infinitum, even if it's already outlasted its useful purpose and an original core identifying purpose to begin. This is similar to that, is that we now have entire organizations that have built the infrastructure and the ongoing, basically infinite demand for our resources and the resources of the West writ large to support these registered refugees. I've never even heard that phrase until this morning, Norm. The phrase registered refugees, which again gets to this issue of, are we looking to solve problems in the Middle East, really, at all? or are these funding efforts more for something else? I don't know, continuation of the U.S. hegemony with the dollar, et cetera. Right? You hear talk of funding of various LGBTQ programs abroad in various areas, educational programs, this kind of stuff, and it just doesn't bear any rational relationship to our foreign diplomacy or our national interest, unless and until one puts it within the framework of economics and geopolitical hegemony with the US dollar. Is this something to just continue flooding the global market with that dollar to make sure that these areas, whatever's going on, continues to spend it?
Well, who knows? And while we're on the topic of the impact of U.S. quote unquote hegemony or power in the world, all eyes on the Biden administration to see how he will respond to the killing of 3 American soldiers and the wounding of dozens of others as a result of an Iranian state-sponsored terrorist attack in Jordan. Will the United States respond with force and vigor? Will this increase global tensions? Are we on the cusp of a world war? In my view, not if we're smart, because we can't even mobilize ourselves around common ideals in this country. And I doubt sending an LGBTQ plus brigade into Jordan is going to solve anything. I think the world is coming unglued because it perceives us as a country without a soul, without a purpose, and without a mission. Historically, international conflicts have united us, but that's because there was something to unite around. I wonder now whether the American century is over because we've decided to worship diversity for diversity's sake, and we've lost touch with any common conception of good, any conception of righteousness, any sense that some things are better than others because we're afraid that we might offend someone. And so as the world adopts the mantle of victimhood, which we, of course, have adopted as our own national creed here in the United States, perhaps we're going to live in a world where the victims seek revenge and the paper tiger at the top, the U.S., sits silently by because we've got nothing to say, nothing to do, no vision of what's good to impose on others, thus creating enormous opportunities for Russia, China, and other nations who aren't similarly encumbered by a disabling ideology.
T Girl says on Rumble, I didn't know this, I'll have to verify, but I trust T. UNRWA was defunded by Trump. Biden reinstated that funding. So.
I think I recall hearing that. Thank you for the point, T-Girl. Another reason to consider Trump 2024. But you'll have to get past Connie Lepore, Drew Faust, David Blight, John Fabian Witt, and the American Historical Society, who, because they didn't need a Neuralink implant in their head to know more than you do, Junior Coltrane. They just remembered it all because it's their job. And because they know so much, they can control our perception of the past and control what we consider in the future because they possess virtue and we don't. Trust and obey. There's no other way. That's the way it works in a republic of virtue.
We appreciate you unwashed and illiterate masses here at Law and Legitimacy. You can find us here every weekday morning, Monday through Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. We broadcast live to YouTube at LawPod Daily, live to X at LawPod Daily, and live on Rumble at Law and Legitimacy. If you don't catch those live streams or prefer the audio only, you can find our podcast. Please go to that podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, Audible, wherever you find premium podcasts, and subscribe. Leave us 5 stars and a nice comment, or leave us alone. Last call to action, please do consider subscribing to the newsletter. We have published 3 newsletters. If you weren't here for the first part of the stream, what is now live on YouTube is our first long form since relaunching the long form non-live interviews with one Pete Atkinson. It's called Grace with Pete Atkinson. It's about 75 minutes long. Inspiring, insightful. I do commend it to anyone, and we've already had some nice feedback from that since publishing yesterday. So please go to lawpoddaily.com, subscribe. We'll get you all looped into the audience base there, and you will start receiving those every Monday morning quietly to your inbox. And I promise, no more than 1 per week.
Yeah, I promise too, since it takes a certain amount of work to get that done, and I don't like working, But on that topic, I got to get out to court. I got an hour and a half drive before the 10 o'clock calendar call, so something tells me I'm going to have to speed to get there. Talk to you tomorrow, everyone.
AMF, yo. See you tomorrow.
AMF.